Everything in The Boys has been building toward one point. But episode 6 of season 5 doesn't just move the story forward, it breaks it apart. Because this is the moment where Homelander stops being just a threat and starts becoming something the world can no longer control. A single decision changes the entire power balance. Allies turn uncertain. Plans that took seasons to build begin to collapse in minutes. And somewhere inside all of this chaos, Gen V isn't just connected anymore. It's actively shaping what comes next. By the end of this episode, the question is no longer who can stop Homelander. It becomes, what is left to save if he cannot be stopped? And the answer is far more disturbing than anyone expected. Episode 6 opens in a world that feels slightly familiar, but deeply unstable. The idea of control is gone. Even the powerful institutions that once held Supes in line are now reacting instead of leading. Homelander is no longer operating like a celebrity weapon of Vought. He is behaving like a system reset. Every move he makes now has long-term consequences, not just for enemies, but for governments, corporations, and even the remaining members of the Seven. What makes this episode different is not just what Homelander does, but how everyone else responds to him. Fear is no longer hidden. It's public. Governments are quietly panicking. Media narratives are breaking apart mid-sentence. Even within Vought, loyalty is starting to fracture in ways that cannot be repaired easily. Meanwhile, the boys are no longer acting like a clean team with one plan. They are divided by urgency. Butcher is no longer interested in strategy in the traditional sense. He is thinking in terms of final outcomes, endings that cannot be undone. Huey is still holding on to hope, but it is thinner now, almost fragile, like it could snap under pressure at any moment. This episode also quietly reshapes the meaning of the virus that once felt like the ultimate solution. What once looked like a guaranteed weapon now feels uncertain, almost outdated in a world that is evolving faster than the plan itself. And then there is Gen V. The connection is no longer subtle. It is structural. The next generation of Supes is not waiting for the boys' war to end. They are already inside it. Characters from Gen V are no longer side references or cameos. They are becoming decision points in the larger conflict. Their abilities, loyalties, and hidden histories now directly influence how both sides prepare for what comes next. There is a growing sense that whatever happens in this episode, it is not the climax. It is the point where everything stops being reversible. By the time the first major shift in the episode arrives, one thing is already clear. This is no longer a fight for control. It is a fight over what kind of world will exist after control is gone. By episode 6, Homelander is no longer reacting to the world. He is reshaping it in real time. What used to be calculated manipulation has now shifted into something more dangerous, certainty. He is no longer testing how far he can go. He already knows there are no real limits left. The injection of V1 has changed everything at a biological and psychological level. His body is no longer just durable, it feels irreversible. That single shift removes the last remaining fear he carried, death. And without death, there is nothing left to restrain him. What makes this version of Homelander more unsettling is not violence, but calmness. He speaks less like a man under pressure, and more like someone who believes history has already chosen its ending. Every decision feels final, not experimental. Even when he shows restraint, it no longer feels like mercy, it feels like timing. Inside Vought, panic is no longer hidden behind corporate language. Executives are no longer planning strategies, they are trying to survive alignment shifts. The company that once controlled heroes is now adjusting itself around one man who no longer needs approval from anyone above him. The Seven, as an idea, starts losing meaning here. It is no longer a team. It is a collection of individuals orbiting a central force. Some try to stay loyal, some start calculating escape, and others quietly begin preparing for betrayal without saying it out loud. What becomes important in this episode is how Homelander begins treating loyalty itself. He no longer sees it as something to reward. He sees it as something to test. And those tests are becoming more unpredictable. A single hesitation, a single unanswered question, can now decide someone's entire fate. This is also where the Gen V connection becomes sharper. Characters tied to Gen V are no longer background assets. They are becoming leverage points. Their abilities, especially those involving mind control, influence, and biological manipulation, start appearing in conversations that suggest larger strategies forming in the shadows. It is implied that Vought's long-term experiments were never isolated. Gen V was not a separate program, it was a continuation of something far older, something designed for this exact moment. That realization quietly reframes everything the boys thought they understood about Soups. Even the boys begin to feel it. Their plans are no longer just about stopping Homelander physically. They are starting to consider whether the system that created him can even be dismantled at this stage. But the most important shift in this section is emotional, not tactical. Homelander is no longer chasing approval. He is replacing it. And once a man decides he does not need to be understood by the world anymore, the world stops being able to predict him. That is where the fear truly begins to spread. Not from what he does, but from the realization that no one can reliably anticipate what comes next. And in the background of all this rising instability, Gen V's influence quietly continues to grow, hinting that the next major move will not come from the boys alone, but from a collision between two generations of Soups that were never meant to exist separately. By episode 6, the boys are no longer moving like a unified strike team. They are moving like people who know time is running out, but cannot agree on what winning even looks like anymore. The virus, once treated as the ultimate equalizer against Soups, now feels unstable in a way no one fully wants to admit. It is not just a weapon anymore. It is a moral collapse waiting to happen. If released, it doesn't just end Homelander's dominance. It risks rewriting what humanity is willing to justify in the name of survival. Butcher sees it differently. For him, the virus is no longer a last option. It is becoming the only logical endpoint. His thinking has narrowed into a brutal clarity. If Homelander exists beyond control, then everything around him is already compromised. In Butcher's mind, hesitation is just another form of surrender. Huey, however, is still holding on to something more fragile. Not hope in victory, but hope in consequences. He understands that once the virus is unleashed, there is no controlled outcome. There is no guarantee it stops at Homelander. It becomes a force that cannot be directed, only released. This disagreement creates a silent fracture in the group. No dramatic break, no final argument, just a growing distance in how they interpret the same reality. Kimiko's arc becomes especially important here. Her perspective is no longer shaped only by violence or protection, but by restraint. She is increasingly shown as someone who understands the cost of reaction. Every fight she avoids now feels like a rejection of the cycle the boys keep returning to. Frenchie, meanwhile, becomes the emotional stabilizer, but also the most conflicted. He understands the science, the mechanics, the logic of the virus. But understanding something does not make it acceptable. And that contradiction begins to weigh on him more heavily as the episode progresses. Mother's Milk represents another layer of tension. His focus is not philosophical. It is generational. He is thinking about what kind of world is left for the next generation if this path is chosen. For him, the virus is not just about stopping Soups. It is about whether humanity is crossing a line it cannot come back from. And underneath all of this, Gen V continues to echo in the background. Because what Gen V introduces is not just new characters. It is a new pipeline of power. Young Soups, experimental systems, and institutional manipulation are now feeding directly into the same ecosystem the boys are trying to destroy. That means even if Homelander is stopped, the structure that created him still exists elsewhere, evolving in parallel. This realization quietly destabilizes the entire mission. The boys are no longer just asking how do we stop him? They are beginning to face a harder question. If we win this way, what exactly are we becoming in the process? That question hangs over every decision in this episode, even when no one says it out loud. And as tensions rise inside the group, outside forces are already moving, meaning the next escalation will not wait for consensus. It will arrive whether the boys are ready or not. Because in this world, hesitation does not pause the war. It simply decides who loses first. Episode 6 starts revealing something deeper than just a war between the boys and Homelander. It begins exposing a layered system of control that stretches far beyond what either side fully understands. And at the center of this hidden structure is the growing influence of Gen V. What once looked like a separate story is now clearly part of the same engineered ecosystem. The younger generation of Soups is not just being introduced for expansion. They are being positioned as variables in a larger experiment that never stopped evolving. Characters tied to Gen V begin appearing in ways that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Their abilities are not just useful. They are strategically aligned with specific weaknesses in both the boys' plans and Vought's internal instability. This suggests that their existence is not random. It is design placement. One of the most unsettling implications of this episode is the idea that Vought's control system has outgrown even its own leadership. What started as corporate manipulation has now turned into something closer to a self-adjusting machine. People like Homelander are not anomalies anymore, they are outcomes. And Gen V is where those outcomes are being refined. The psychic and mind-influencing abilities introduced through Gen V-linked characters become especially important here. They hint at a future where control is no longer physical or political, but psychological. If someone can rewrite belief itself, then traditional warfare becomes irrelevant. This is where the episode quietly shifts tone. It is no longer just about stopping Homelander's dominance. It is about whether free will is still the dominant force in this universe, or if it has already been replaced by engineered behavior. Inside the boys, this realization lands differently for each member. For Huey, it deepens his fear that they are reacting too late to something already structurally complete. For Butcher, it reinforces his belief that the system cannot be reformed, only destroyed. For others, it creates doubt about whether victory even has a clear definition anymore. Meanwhile, Vought continues to operate like a fractured but functional organism. Publicly, it still maintains order. Privately, it is adapting to a world where soups are no longer assets, they are geopolitical variables. Every decision now has global consequences, and every soup with influence becomes a potential destabilizing force. This is also where the connection between Gen V and the boys becomes more than narrative. It becomes strategic. The two worlds are no longer parallel. They are converging. What happens in one directly alters the conditions in the other. And beneath it all is a disturbing realization. Homelander may not be the peak of this system. He may be just the most visible version of it. That idea reframes everything. Because if he is not the endpoint, then stopping him does not end the cycle. It only resets it. By the end of this section, the audience is left with a quiet but heavy understanding. The real power is not just in individuals anymore. It is in the structure that keeps producing them. And that structure is still intact. Which means the war is not moving toward closure. It is moving toward expansion. By the end of episode 6, the entire board has changed. Not in one dramatic explosion, but through a series of irreversible shifts that quietly lock every character into a narrower set of outcomes. Homelander stands at the center of this new reality, no longer just powerful but stabilized in a way that removes uncertainty from his actions. The V1 injection does not simply enhance him, it removes the last remaining psychological friction inside him. What is left is a version of Homelander that does not hesitate, not because he is reckless, but because he no longer sees reasons to doubt himself. This is what makes him more dangerous than before. Earlier versions of him still carried emotional instability, need for validation, fear of rejection, unpredictable reactions to personal betrayal. Now those cracks are fading, and in their place is something far more controlled and far less human. The boys, on the other hand, are no longer operating with a single unified direction. Their plan is fragmented, not because they lack intelligence, but because they no longer agree on what survival even means. The virus, once a clean solution in theory, now feels like a moral breaking point no one can fully endorse without consequence. Even those willing to use it understand the cost. It is not just about ending Homelander. It is about whether the world that remains after him will still resemble anything worth saving. Gen V's influence becomes most important here because it represents continuity. Even if Homelander falls, the system that created him does not. The next generation of soups, shaped, tested, and influenced by institutions like Vought, ensures that the cycle is not ending. It is evolving. That is the uncomfortable truth this episode builds toward. There is no single final enemy. There is only a repeating structure that keeps generating new versions of the same problem. And that changes the emotional weight of everything. Because victory no longer means stopping Homelander. It now means something much less clear. Interrupting a system that is designed to survive any one individual loss. This is where the tone of the episode becomes almost philosophical. Characters are no longer just choosing sides. They are choosing interpretations of reality. Butcher believes destruction is the only honest response left. Huey still clings to the idea that outcomes matter more than methods. Others sit somewhere in between, increasingly unsure whether either position is enough. And then comes the final implication of the episode's structure. Escalation is no longer linear. Every solution creates a new problem. Every weapon creates a new imbalance. Every alliance creates a future betrayal. Nothing resets cleanly anymore. As episode 6 closes, the feeling is not resolution, it is acceleration. The world is moving faster than anyone's ability to control it, and every faction is now locked into a path they cannot easily reverse. Homelander is stronger, but no longer alone in shaping the future. The boys are more determined, but less unified. Vought is still standing, but increasingly reactive. And Gen V is no longer a side story. It is the next layer of the same machine, still turning underneath everything else. The final takeaway is simple but unsettling. This was not an episode about ending the war. It was the episode where the war stopped having an off-ramp.